An HR management software company was conducting business reviews for executives every quarter. All department heads met to discuss the previous quarter's performance and activities done, and the plan for the next quarter. The 2 weeks prior to each review, each of the departments, sales, marketing, product, finance, and more, were working to gather data and align on their messaging for the QBR. PowerPoint presentations had to be done weeks in advance, so there were enough time to stitch them all together from different teams, edit, proofread, and practice before showing to the executives. Not only did this take an enormous amount of time away from other important tasks, by the time the presentations were all put together and finalized, the information in them was already out of date and conflicted with data presented by other parts of the organization. With ThunderAct, all of that time-consuming preparation is no longer needed. Cross-organizational state of the business and consumer communication insights are always available for review. QBRs can then focus on what is important, working in a unified team and making informed business decisions based on data. To learn more about ThunderAct's incredible AI-powered data analysis and business advisory capabilities, visit ThunderAct.com to start a free trial.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us again. My name is Ashley. I'll be helping co-host this event. Super excited. For our first session, we have Michael Fertik, and he's going to be speaking about the innovation and investment in intelligent enterprise decision-making. Michael, I will turn it over to you whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Ashley, can you hear me well?
Yes, you sound great.
Great. Thank you very much to everybody. Thanks to Ashley. Thanks to Noi Bar and to ThunderAct, which is a terrific company for hosting us. And also thanks to everyone for joining us today. It's a extremely busy and unusual time in Silicon Valley and of course human history. And all of you are very busy and your time is very valuable. And thank you for spending it with me. I know that so many of us are looking forward to so many very interesting sessions that Noi has curated today. I'm speaking to you from California, where I live. And my background is chiefly as an entrepreneur. I'm now 41 years old. I started my first software company when I was 19, probably like some of you. And I grew and have grown and sold several companies in high tech, and also now in the last 5-6 years in life sciences as an entrepreneur. And I became an investor in 2016 as Heroic Ventures. And I'm very proud to be an investor in a number of companies in Silicon Valley and in Israel, in high tech, in consumer and in enterprise. My topic today is a kind of a setup in some ways for some of the other topics that will be covered by some of the terrific speakers who will be following throughout the day. And it's about how decisions get done. I'll be bringing some of my experience as the founder and executive chairman of Reputation.com. I'm rocking our sweatshirt. And also some experience I have with selling a lot of enterprise software as I have over the years to a lot of organizations, making a lot of enterprise software and investing in companies that have made enterprise software, but also in building companies that have a consumer focus, which is to say that consumers, companies, also, of course, have to make complex decisions about product. And I think it's very interesting because a lot of people in Silicon Valley are historically minded, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking about history. It's interesting to consider the history of product management for a second, because it gives some insight, helps us understand how we got here and how things became so complicated today. The history of product management might be traced back to a fellow named Neil McElroy, I think is how his name was pronounced, who was at Procter & Gamble, P&G, which is a very famous consumer brand. And the consumer part of his business was in Procter & Gamble. And he wrote a memo in 1931, I believe, about 90 years ago, advocating for more dollars, for more budget, for what he called brand men. He wanted to hire brand men. That was his phrase. And brand men were, in his view, intended to be people who lived and breathed the brand of a single product or product line. And it was his idea that someone had to be obsessed all day and all night, all week and all month, all year with one product brand or one suite of products. And that was his idea, and it was budgeted. He was given budget dollars. He later went on to be the Secretary of Defense of the United States, and I think the head of NASA as well. Very, very remarkable career he had, Neil McElroy. Anyway, that history of product management coming from brand was very interesting. And then the concept of brand lived inside an organization generally called marketing, and it still does in some places. And then eventually, in the 90s, it kind of came to tech, and it came to tech through a door of Scrum, of how do you make products faster through Scrum techniques. And then in 2001, there was a kind of an interesting milestone in the history of product management, I think, from a group of guys who got together who intended to build something called the Agile Manifesto. How do you build products, software products, very fast through Agile? And Agile, of course, is part of everyone's lexicon nowadays, but it came from this Agile Manifesto, and some work, no doubt, preceded it, I'm sure. But the Agile Manifesto was a product of 2001. And it was then that the software developers said we have to have more of a voice in how to design products and how to make products quickly and so forth and so on. It was very interesting. So the idea of the product manager and of the software product manager and product management came about really about 20 years ago and started to flower really about 20 years ago. And there's some prehistory and there's some post-history, of course. But since then, so many things have happened. Everyone who works in marketing or in product or in software development, every one of us knows that there's something called marketing, there's something called product, there's something called software, then there's something else called product marketing. And these 3 or 4 entities, organizations, and sometimes there are more, but these 3 or 4 functions coexist in kind of a form of harmony, but also a form of tension with one another. And they are differently staffed. They have different ownership in different organizations, and the culture of any one company in managing their relationships and managing their priorities is always different. But always it exists to do one thing. It exists to make sure, all these functions exist to make sure the customers are identified and satisfied, that they're identified and they're satisfied. They're identified as the right prospects, they're identified as the right customers, and they're satisfied with the existing product suite, but also with new features, new functions, new developments, new additions, new products, and so forth that are add-ons to the suite, sometimes through M&A, sometimes through organic development of new products. But the growth and the history of the product development function can help us understand how and why, these things went very well, and these things became very clear, but also the tension that developed among the different organizations. Well, another set of interesting problems arose in the last maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years, which is that a set of tools that were single-purpose tools came along that started to have value to the organization, to the product lifecycle development organization, that were greater than their original intent or purpose. So I think someone today will be talking about Salesforce. I hope so anyway. Salesforce is a place where the sales team isn't able to communicate with customers and understand their prospects, understand their different priorities, understand what's a good prospect, what's a lost prospect, what's a good prospect, what's a bad prospect, understand the feedback. And of course, salespeople are trying to make a number, but in the course of operating their companies, operating their Rolodexes, what they're doing with their CRM is capturing notes from customers and so forth. Well, the same can be said for many tools that are used by developers, whether it's a HipChat or if it's a GitHub or a GitLab, for example, where they are getting feedback from developers, they're getting feedback from one another, they're understanding usability and so forth, or the QA function, the QA organization, which gets all this feedback, all this understanding for both the smoke testing internally, but the feedback they're getting from external users power users, casual users, and so forth. They're capturing all these notes somewhere. They're getting all the information somewhere. And then another example would be a lot of different dynamic functions like Slack. How do you, when customers or product developers or product managers are interacting with one another and are capturing notes in communication style, whether it's email, for example, where a lot of information lives, or Slack, where a lot of information lives. This is a very valuable tool where that different organizations use, or example of a set of tools that different organizations use to understand what's working and what's not. And of course, customer success has their own tools. Probably less Slack, probably more Twitter, probably less Slack, probably more email, where they're capturing notes. The notes are coming to and from customers and so forth. Even logs of phone calls can be very, very useful, and notes from phone calls. Well, now you've got a classic problem of software development, which is something begins small, then gets more complex, something gets smaller again, gets more complex. We are in the complexifying phase in the product development, product management history. We're in the complexifying phase. The complexifying phase is what it sounds like. It is a phase in which you have a proliferation of tools, of platforms, and of data sources that could be very helpful to product developers. And of course, the product development, product management mission is always the same. How do we make sure that we make the best decisions to identify and satisfy our customers? Well, product managers have gotten very expert, of course, product leadership organizations, at interviewing, at rapid prototyping, and so forth. These are extremely valuable tools, and they shouldn't go anywhere. They're not going anywhere, and they shouldn't go anywhere. But there's so much information that's already coming in casually from these purpose-built platforms like Salesforce and Slack and HipChat, email, that is getting lost because of the signal-to-noise ratio, or because it's just not getting ingested well by the product leadership organization. And there's so much inexpensive, free, rich data that should be mined, that could be mined, that is available, and is being overlooked. Now, every organization overlooks it. There's no shame in knowing that your organization overlooks it. The best run organizations overlook this information. But to be sure, there are ways now to aggregate this information. There are ways now to understand this information. At reputation.com, for example, which I'm no longer involved day to day, but I'm aware enough of some of the doings of the company. It's a 500-person company, plus or minus, and part of the product leadership function is devoted simply to the prospect of extracting this kind of information from the sales leadership, from customer success leadership, and so forth. And one of the things that we've ended up doing is bringing the customer success org and the product org much closer together, because so much of the product learnings come from the customer success org. So by the way, just by way of DNA and taxonomy, the product organization inside Reputation is a kind of a strong product organization. It's not subsumed into the marketing or other orgs. It is by itself, reporting directly to the CEO, and very, very, very strongly organized. Different orgs have different ways of organizing product leadership and so forth. That's just the style of Reputation. But the product team at Reputation is one of the smallest. It's also, by the way, very close to the data science team, which is a different team. The data science team is a different team. The data science team, of course, both has an external function, meaning making products that are better, that are data products for end customers, but also an internal function, understanding this vast supply of data from so many different sources, of all the feedback and insights that you're getting from customers, and feeding that back into the product org. So very rich organization there. But I think it's very interesting to see how the history of product, which basically comes out of brand, which basically lived in marketing, which basically then later on in the history of technology started to stand on its own, became a living, breathing phenomenon in Silicon Valley, and then started to get its own tools, and now has become so complex it's very, very hard to manage all the data flow. Now, once you have your arms around all that data flow, and of course, as you know, getting your arms around it is very difficult. There's a lot of constant data flow. It's hard to prioritize. It's hard to understand what's very important. It's hard to understand what is being said the most, what is being said the most loudly, and then differentiating what's being said the most loudly by external users from what's being repeated most loudly by people inside your org. Maybe you have a salesperson who's extremely gung-ho about her customers and she's very adamant and she's right, but maybe she's wrong. Maybe you have a VP of customer success who is really on the ball and she's not quite as adamant about her product priorities as the sales team might be. So making sure that you both collect the data and then amplify it intelligently and accurately inside the organization has proved to be very, very difficult. So at a couple of companies I've worked with, that data aggregation function, that data understanding function has actually turned out to be an entire priority for an entire team of people who basically have to sift and sieve through all this information and then deliver it up to the CEO or the product leader or the GM to make sense of and then to prioritize things. Now, when does this get difficult? This is a very interesting thing. I live with a lot of startups. I probably live with as many startups as many of you do. And some of you work at large companies and have built very large companies. I have found that this really becomes an issue much earlier in the history of a company than anyone would have predicted, including me. Usually around 50 people or 80 people, this becomes a major issue. How to collect all the information that's necessary to understand the priorities properly of the product development lifecycle and make intelligent decisions for the enterprise of product prioritization. Now, why is it 50 or 80? Around 50 or 80 people, and there's some research and organizational behavior research around that. That's when you stop knowing people's first names and the name of their spouse and their kids and their dogs and so forth. And that's number one. Often, especially today, and possibly especially going forward into the future, we're not in one building anymore. We're not in one room anymore. So the casual water cooler conversation or the casual water cooler sharing information phase is now impaired as compared to what it was when we were in the halcyon days of 10 people or 20 people and everyone, the whole company was in the stand-up, so to speak. Well, also around 50 or 80 people, a couple of things have happened. One, usually implies that this is true if you have a startup or a kind of an internal startup, an internal business division. Around 50 or 80 people, what's happened? Your first SKU may still be going strong, or you may be planning your second SKU, or slightly different pricing models, or your first code base, and this is important, your first code base may be getting a little bit more tired, maybe needing some major revamping, or may not be prepared for the kind of scale you now have as compared to when you had 5 employees, now you have 50, 80 employees. That implies a certain level of scale usually of usage and custom and purchase and business and commerce. So what are you doing now? Your org, your product org, your engineering org now has to have 2 competing priorities: new stuff, maintenance and upgrade. New stuff, maintenance and upgrade. And as you know, that's a very, very difficult balance. And therefore, the number of resources available on an absolute basis and relative basis for new stuff has decreased because you need some group of people on your team, including some talented people, to work on the maintenance and upgrade. Fine. Well, what does that mean? That means that knowing how to make those decisions and collect all the information becomes even more important, a higher organizational priority, because you're not just responding to the loudest voice, internal, external, you're responding also to the most correct voice. And sifting and sieving through all that information, identifying the correct voice and identifying the right priority is very, very hard. So I have learned over the last 10 years that making that a priority as a matter of investment, which is kind of hard to do, and it's a job that some people really want and they're not qualified because they're business school types sometimes who want a job called strategy, or sometimes it's a job people don't want because it's going to piss people off. It's going to make people more annoyed. Maybe they're MBAs or maybe they're engineers, but they're the right people for the job because they can really tell the truth and filter through all the noise and get to the signal for what the truth is, what the best decision is. That's a very important job. And so I am very delighted to, not to kick off the day, I know there's an introduction from ThunderAct, but to help set the table for the balance of the speakers today, because so many of you of the speakers will be going into detail about these different themes and having their own flavors of it. But I think the idea of ThunderAct and the promise of ThunderAct, which is so attractive to me and I think so attractive to the people who are around this table. And thanks to Noi for that. The promise of ThunderAct is helping us in this complexifying time to make sense of it all and to take this function, this weird, unpredictable function of collecting the information, sifting through the information, and getting the right answer, of turning that into a software-enabled process that is much more accurate, much more dynamic, and much more fruitful, productive, and lucrative, is a terrific promise. And I think that is why I'm so excited to support Noi and ThunderAct today. Thank you, Noi. Thank you, Ashley. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you very, very much, Michael. That was very fascinating, and we'll definitely want to hear from you again in the future.